Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
I was in the middle of a grueling 12-hour shift at the county hospital in suburban Ohio, meticulously updating patient charts under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights that always seemed to buzz like a swarm of irritated bees. When my cell phone vibrated insistently in my pocket, pulling me away from the routine that had become my anchor after years of single motherhood and financial tightropes, and upon answering, the voice of a doctor from a distant emergency room in Chicago delivered the devastating news that my 28-year-old son Jake had suddenly collapsed at his job site due to a severe bacterial infection that had escalated into full-blown sepsis, leaving him isolated in the intensive care unit with tubes snaking across his body and monitors beeping warnings that echoed the terror gripping my heart as I realized he was enduring this life-threatening ordeal entirely alone, without the comfort of familiar faces or the steady hand of his mother who was trapped 300 miles away by rush-hour traffic that crawled slower than molasses on a winter day. Jake, that dependable young man who had shouldered the burdens of our fractured family since his father walked out a decade ago, trading stability for fleeting affairs and leaving us to scrape by on my nursing salary and his part-time gigs, now lay vulnerable in a sterile room where strangers dictated his fate, his robust frame, honed from weekend hikes and coaching Little League, reduced to fragility under the weight of an invisible enemy that doctors described as aggressive and unpredictable. Their updates sparse and clinical over the crackling phone line that only amplified my helplessness as I dashed to my beat-up sedan in the employee lot, fumbling with keys while visions of his pale face and labored breaths flooded my mind, compelling me to book the first available flight, despite the exorbitant cost that would dent my emergency savings built painstakingly over sleepless nights. As the engine roared to life and I merged onto the interstate, weaving through semis and sedans driven by oblivious commuters chatting on Bluetooth about mundane dinners, my thoughts spiraled into a vortex of guilt and fury, replaying the last conversation we had shared just 2 days prior over lukewarm takeout pizza in my modest kitchen on Elm Street, where he had joked about his upcoming promotion at the construction firm and promised to visit soon for Mother's Day, oblivious to the storm brewing in his veins that would soon sideline him in isolation, far from the home-cooked meals and late-night talks that had fortified our bond against the world's indifference. It was in that suspended moment of highway hypnosis, with the sun dipping low and casting elongated shadows across the dashboard, that another notification pierced the tension, this one a text message from my estranged mother Evelyn, a woman whose absence had defined much of my adult life since she abandoned us 20 years earlier in pursuit of warmer climates and questionable romances in Florida, her words popping up uninvited to demand $10,000 for an extravagant wedding dress to impress her latest suitor, Victor, a self-proclaimed entrepreneur whose charm she had fallen for hook, line, and sinker, as if the timing of her matrimonial whimsy could eclipse the gravity of her grandson's solitary battle against mortality in a city hospital bed. The audacity of it all struck me like a thunderclap, my grip tightening on the wheel until my palms ached, because how could this woman, who had vanished without so much as a backward glance during my darkest hours of postpartum depression and mounting bills after Jake's birth, now resurface with such tone-deaf entitlement, prioritizing silken gowns and floral arches over the raw desperation of a family member's survival, her message laced with emojis of hearts and rings that only deepened the chasm of resentment widening in my chest as I pulled over at a rest stop, tears streaming down my face while the world blurred into a haze of truckers and vending machines. In a surge of impulsive defiance, fueled by the injustice of her oblivious greed clashing against Jake's precarious condition, I opened the banking application on my phone with trembling fingers, initiating a transfer of precisely $1 to her account, attaching a curt note that read, "By some morals instead," the action providing a fleeting catharsis amid the chaos. A small rebellion against the generational betrayals that had left me wary of blood ties thinner than the cheap coffee I sipped to steady my nerves, even as doubt flickered about whether this petty gesture would invite repercussions in our already strained financial web. The remainder of the journey to the airport unfolded in a blur of security lines and overpriced snacks, my phone remaining stubbornly quiet save for intermittent reports from Jake's medical team confirming his stability teetered on a knife's edge. With no visitation permitted yet due to quarantine protocols, each silence amplifying the isolation he faced without the reassurance of loved ones. While I wrestled with the irony of Evelyn's demand mirroring the very opportunism she had instilled in me to avoid through sheer willpower and elbow grease. As the first hints of dawn filtered through the terminal's vast windows, painting the empty gates in soft grays and golds that belied the turmoil within, my device illuminated once more. This time with a call from an unrecognized number bearing the prefix of my local bank, and the voice that greeted me belonged to the branch manager, Mr. Hargrove, his tone laced with urgency as he referenced an irregular transaction linked to my profile, stemming directly from that $1 send that had triggered automated alerts for potential fraud, insisting on an immediate in-person discussion to avert what he vaguely described as cascading complications involving dormant accounts and unauthorized accesses that could unravel more than just my peace of mind, leaving me rooted to the spot amid dozing travelers, the weight of impending revelations pressing down as heavily as the backpack slung over my shoulder. Wondering if my act of witty retribution had inadvertently cracked open a Pandora's box of familial secrets far more perilous than any wedding expense. The bank manager's voice, steady yet edged with the kind of caution that comes from handling too many delicate situations in a career spanning decades, cut through the early morning hush of the airport terminal like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. Identifying himself as Mr. Hargrove from the First National branch in downtown Cleveland, where I had banked faithfully since the days of paper checks and teller lines that snaked around the lobby, and he proceeded to outline how my impulsive $1 transfer to Evelyn had illuminated a series of irregularities buried in the system, dormant joint accounts from my parents' era that she apparently retained access to despite the years of estrangement. Small incremental withdrawals disguised as routine fees that had quietly eroded my nest egg over the past 6 months, each one timestamped to coincide with her Florida escapades like weekend getaways to the Keys or impulse buys at high-end boutiques that catered to women chasing a second youth. Seated on a hard plastic bench amid the shuffle of early risers nursing their coffees and scrolling through news feeds oblivious to my unraveling world, I absorbed his words with a growing nod of indignation twisting in my gut. Because this wasn't just opportunistic pilfering, but a calculated erosion of the security I had built brick by brick after Evelyn's abrupt departure 2 decades ago, when she loaded her station wagon with linens and regrets one crisp autumn morning, citing irreconcilable differences with the life we had in that modest ranch house on the outskirts of Akron, leaving me, a wide-eyed 25-year-old with a newborn Jake in my arms, to navigate the labyrinth of welfare offices and double shifts at the diner just to keep the lights on and formula in the fridge. Mr. Hargrove suggested we meet at the branch as soon as my flight landed, promising printouts and safeguards to lock down the breaches, so I boarded that cramped regional jet with my mind churning through fragmented memories of family dinners where Evelyn's laughter had once filled the room before souring into complaints about small-town monotony, her eyes always drifting toward the horizon as if our existence was a temporary stop on her grander itinerary. And now those same restless impulses had manifested in digital thefts that threatened to compound the crisis of Jake's solitary vigil in the Chicago ICU, where updates from his nurses described his condition as holding steady but precarious, his body locked in a fierce internal war against the infection, without the solace of my presence or even a voicemail from the grandmother who should have been rallying support rather than siphoning funds. Touching down in the gray drizzle of a Midwest afternoon, I hailed a cab straight to the bank, the driver prattling about gas prices and election polls that washed over me like background noise. And upon arriving at Mr. Hargrove's office, with its paneled walls and the faint scent of fresh ink from the printer, he spread out the documents like a prosecutor's evidence, highlighting forged authorizations in handwriting that matched Evelyn's looping script from old holiday cards. Transactions funneled through shell accounts linked to Victor's supposed business ventures that smelled of pyramid schemes from the get-go. each revelation peeling back layers of betrayal that made my blood simmer, with a mix of sorrow and sharp-witted resolve to turn the tables without descending into the chaos she thrived on. As we initiated freezes and alerts on the affected lines, a wry humor bubbled up through the outrage, prompting me to quip to Mr. Hargrove about how family reunions ought to come with financial audits, eliciting a polite chuckle from him that lightened the air just enough to breathe, and on the drive home afterward, fueled by that spark, I crafted an anonymous post on a popular wedding forum she frequented, detailing a cautionary tale of a meddlesome matriarch whose bridal dreams were unraveling due to ethical lapses in budgeting. The words veiled enough to evade backlash, but pointed enough to draw speculative comments from brides-to-be sharing their own vendor woes. A subtle revenge that unfolded in real-time notifications pinging my phone as I pulled into my driveway. The satisfaction of it warming me like a shot of bourbon on a cold night, even as guilt nipped at the edges for weaponizing public scrutiny against someone who had already wandered so far from our circle. Settling into the quiet of my living room with its faded couch and shelves of Jake's childhood photos staring back accusingly, I fired off a quick email to the hospital coordinator arranging my travel for the morning, my fingers hovering over the send button while pondering the deeper fractures this exposed, like why Evelyn's greed seemed timed to Jake's vulnerability, perhaps a subconscious bid for attention amid her own unraveling life. But before I could dwell further, a new message arrived from an unfamiliar sender, attaching a grainy photo of Jake's hospital corridor taken from inside the room, the timestamp recent and the caption reading, "He had company you didn't expect." The image capturing a blurred figure in the doorway that sent a jolt through me stronger than any caffeine, because if Jake wasn't truly alone in his fight, who was this interloper stepping into the shadows of our story? And just as I zoomed in on the pixelated outline, a knock echoed from the front door, sharp and insistent, revealing Evelyn on my doorstep with a suitcase in hand and a storm in her eyes, demanding entry to hash out the sabotage that had her wedding plans teetering on collapse right as her world imploded. Evelyn's unexpected arrival on my doorstep that drizzly evening carried the weight of unresolved histories pressing against the screen door like an uninvited storm. Her figure silhouetted by the porch light in a rumpled blouse and slacks that spoke of hasty travel from Florida, suitcase abandoned at her feet as she fixed me with those sharp blue eyes inherited from my grandmother, demanding in a voice laced with accusation and desperation to know why I was systematically dismantling her future with Victor through anonymous online barbs and frozen funds, claiming that my interference had not only humiliated her in front of the wedding coordinator, but had also triggered cancellations from vendors who whispered about unreliable clients with shady financial trails, all while she gestured wildly with hands bedecked in costume jewelry that clinked like false promises against the humid air. I stepped aside reluctantly, ushering her into the living room where the scent of cooling lasagna from my solitary dinner still lingered on the air, the space cluttered with Jake's old baseball trophies and medical bills stacked on the coffee table like accusations of my own failures to shield him from life's cruelties. And as she sank onto the couch with a dramatic sigh that echoed the theatrics of her youth when she would stage family arguments for attention, she launched into a convoluted explanation of how the $10,000 request for the dress was merely the tip of an iceberg formed by Victor's crumbling empire, a network of real estate flips gone sour amid rising interest rates that had ensnared retirees like her in promises of quick riches, leaving her entangled in cosign loans and IOUs that demanded immediate cash infusions to prevent foreclosure on the condo they shared overlooking the Gulf. Listening to her unravel the threads of this deception, I felt a turbulent mix of pity and revulsion churning within, because while part of me recognized the familiar pattern of her leaping into ill-advised ventures that always circled back to family for bailouts, another part bristled at the timing, how she could articulate these woes with such self-focused fervor mere days after learning, or perhaps ignoring, the gravity of Jake's isolation in that Chicago hospital, where his latest vitals report painted a picture of relentless fever spikes and antibiotic resistance that kept him tethered to machines without the grounding presence of kin. A solitude that amplified my Own guilt for not being there to whisper encouragements or adjust his pillow. Probing deeper amid the tension that thickened the room like unshed tears, I retrieved my laptop from the side table and pulled up the bank statements Mr. Hargrove had emailed earlier, confronting her with the digital footprints of her incursions. Those sly transfers masked as gifts for grandkids' futures that had actually padded Victor's poker nights and her spa retreats, each entry a betrayal that eroded the trust one had tentatively rebuilt in solitude, and though she deflected with tales of necessity born from loneliness after my father's passing, her words faltered when I withheld the full extent of Jake's peril, choosing instead to describe his condition in vague terms of holding on without specifics on the ventilators or the experimental protocols his doctors were debating, a disagreeable decision that sat heavy in my conscience like undigested regret because it weaponized his vulnerability against her opportunism, yet felt necessary to preserve the fragile sanctuary of our mother-son bond from further intrusion by someone whose affections always came with strings attached. As the clock ticked past midnight and shadows lengthened across the carpet from the single lamp's glow, a sly opportunity for retribution presented itself when she stepped out to take a call from Victor, leaving her phone unattended on the armrest. And with a quick glance to ensure privacy, I accessed the wedding planner's contact from her recent messages, forwarding a discreet alert about Victor's impending legal troubles pieced together from public records and Hargrove's insights, ensuring the deposit for the venue, a quaint beachside chapel she had gushed about, would evaporate into cancellation fees without direct confrontation, the act delivering a witty sting of satisfaction that had me suppressing a chuckle at the irony of her matrimonial dreams dissolving faster than sugar in rain, even as a twinge of what if nagged about whether this escalation might push her toward genuine reform or deeper resentment. The conversation meandered into thornier territory then, Evelyn alluding to a box of old letters stashed in the attic of our childhood home, correspondence from distant relatives that hinted at family secrets predating her departure. Subtle clues dropped like breadcrumbs about Jake's potential ties to an extended lineage she had long concealed, perhaps a cousin or uncle who could alter the dynamics of inheritance and support in ways that explained the anonymous hospital visitor glimpsed in that eerie photo, her voice softening with what seemed like reluctant vulnerability as she suggested these documents might illuminate why she had distanced herself so abruptly all those years ago, planting seeds of curiosity that warred with my skepticism born from too many broken assurances. We parted uneasily around 2 in the morning, her claiming the guest room for a night's rest before heading back south, but sleep eluded me as I lay in the darkness listening to the house creak under the weight of unspoken accusations, my mind replaying her hints about those letters that now loomed like ghosts in the attic, promising revelations that could either mend or shatter the fragile threads holding our fractured clan together, until the shrill ring of my phone shattered the quiet at dawn, the caller ID flashing the Chicago hospital's number with a nurse's urgent tone conveying that Jake's condition had deteriorated overnight into a critical complication involving organ stress no one had anticipated, her words trailing off into instructions for immediate travel while in the background I caught Evelyn stirring in the hallway, her footsteps halting as if eavesdropping on the crisis she had so casually overlooked, leaving me to grapple with the dawning suspicion that her deceptions might entwine more intimately with Jake's suffering than any wedding farce could conceal. The urgent summons from the Chicago hospital propelled me into a frenzy of packing and airport scrambles that blurred the boundaries between night and day. My suitcase zipped hastily with essentials like Jake's favorite blanket and a stack of dog-eared novels from our shared reading rituals, while Evelyn trailed behind me through the house like a persistent shadow, insisting on accompanying me on the flight under the guise of familial solidarity now that Victor's arrest had left her unmoored. And desperate for redemption in the eyes of the grandson she had neglected for so long, her arguments laced with pleas about making amends through presence rather than presence, though I suspected her motives intertwined with scouting opportunities to leverage Jake's vulnerability for whatever scraps of inheritance or sympathy she could glean from our strained legacy. Boarding the plane together felt like an uneasy truce forged in the pressure cooker of crisis, the cabin's recycled air thick with The murmurs of fellow passengers and the faint aroma of in-flight meals that turned my stomach as Evelyn chattered nervously about the beachside ceremony that was now a casualty of my anonymous tips to the authorities. Her voice dropping to conspiratorial whispers about how Victor's Ponzi operation had ensnared not just her savings, but a web of elderly neighbors who viewed her as the unwitting face of their losses, painting a picture of communal outrage that almost elicited sympathy if not for the recollection of her earlier message demanding funds amid Jake's peril, a disconnect that had me staring out the window at the patchwork of clouds below, pondering the selective blindness that allowed her to prioritize lace trimmings over life support beeps. Upon landing and rushing to the ICU, through corridors lined with beeping monitors and weary families huddled in clusters, the reality of Jake's deterioration hit like a physical blow, his room a fortress of 4 stands and privacy curtains. Where the doctor, a harried woman with a clipboard clutched like a shield, detailed the escalation into multi-organ involvement that necessitated aggressive interventions. Her explanations peppered with terms like cytokine storms and dialysis prep that underscored the razor-thin margin between recovery and irreversible damage, all witnessed by Evelyn, who hovered at the periphery, her face paling as she absorbed the gravity she had sidestepped in her texts, yet even then she maneuvered to insert herself, suggesting she hold Jake's hand during the next procedure to convey grandmotherly love, a manipulation that ignited a fierce protectiveness in me because after years of absence, her sudden claim on intimacy felt like an invasion rather than an olive branch. The deeper family secret began to surface amid the tension of that sterile vigil, Evelyn pulling me aside into a quiet alcove off the nurse's station where vending machines hummed softly, confessing in hushed tones about a half-sibling to Jake from her pre-marriage indiscretions, a boy given up for adoption in the 70s whose existence she had buried under layers of denial and relocation, hinting that recent searches funded by Victor's ill-gotten gains had resurfaced traces of him in the Midwest. Perhaps the very figure behind the anonymous donations to Jake's care that Hargrove had flagged in updated bank records linking back to my own youthful naivety in signing over paternal rights unknowingly, a twist that reframed her deceptions as desperate cover-ups for a lifetime of hidden shames rather than pure avarice, leaving me torn between outrage at the withheld truths and a reluctant curiosity about how this phantom relative might reshape our isolated narrative. My decision to evict her from Jake's room crystallized in that moment of raw confrontation, summoning security with a firm directive that echoed through the hallway as I barred her from crossing the threshold, a harsh choice that twisted like a knife in my ribs because while it safeguarded Jake's space from her opportunistic energy, it also isolated her in the waiting area amid strangers' sympathetic glances, prompting an internal debate that mirrored what any listener might feel. Whether mercy toward flawed kin outweighed the sanctity of boundaries forged in betrayal, her protests fading into sobs that clawed at my resolve even as I returned to Jake's side, stroking his forehead and whispering assurances drawn from our shared history of overcoming odds like schoolyard bullies and economic downturns. The revenge against Victor materialized cleverly from the hospital's guest lounge later that evening, where over a tray of institutional jello that wobbled like my fraying patience, I compiled a comprehensive packet from Hargrove's latest emails, detailing the fraud's tentacles into community trusts and falsified deeds, and forwarded it to the district attorney's tip line with meticulous anonymity, including timestamps that align Victor's calls with Evelyn's transfers, ensuring his bail hearing the next day would crumble under the weight of evidence that painted him as the architect of widespread ruin. The confirmation email arriving with a subtle thrill that had me smirking at the justice of a con man facing his own elaborate unraveling. A witty payback that extended indirectly to Evelyn by severing her last tether to false security without my hands directly soiled. As night deepened and the hospital settled into its rhythmic hush broken only by occasional pages over the intercom, subtle clues continued to accumulate like puzzle pieces in the dim light. The nurse mentioning a visitor's log entry with initials that matched the adoption records Evelyn had vaguely described. coupled with a bouquet of lilies on the windowsill bearing a card in faded ink reminiscent of my father's handwriting from holiday notes long ago, suggesting this hidden siblings' involvement stretched beyond finances into a quiet vigil that challenged the notion of Jake's aloneness and hinted at reparations for generational oversights I had never fully grasped. Relief flickered briefly when the monitors stabilized around midnight, granting a momentary reprieve in which I dozed fitfully in the recliner by his bed, but it shattered as Jake's eyelids fluttered open in the pre-dawn gloom, his gaze locking onto mine with a clarity born of delirium's edge, and in a voice raspy from disuse, he murmured a cryptic message about a promise Evelyn had extracted from him during a secretive phone call weeks prior, one involving family oaths and concealed inheritances that bound us all in ways I could scarcely imagine, his words dissolving into exhausted sleep as the door creaked open behind me, admitting a figure whose silhouette promised to propel this tangled saga toward an explosive reckoning. The silhouette materializing in the doorway of Jake's ICU room as dawn's first light filtered through the blinds carried an aura of quiet authority that halted my breath mid-gasp, resolving into the form of a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and features that echoed a ghostly resemblance to my father's stern profile from faded photographs tucked away in family albums. His presence explained in a soft-spoken introduction as Daniel, the half-brother Evelyn had alluded to in her fragmented confessions, a product of her youthful folly in the swinging 60s before she settled into the role of wife and mother, adopted out to a stable family in Indiana where he had built a life as a quiet accountant, only to resurface through genealogical searches prompted by his own health scares that mirrored Jake's in uncanny ways, drawing him to anonymously fund the experimental treatments and linger in hospital shadows to offer silent solidarity without the baggage of direct confrontation. As he stepped forward with a tentative handshake that conveyed years of suppressed curiosity about the siblings he had never known, Evelyn burst in from the corridor where she had been pacing like a caged animal since her eviction the night before, her eyes widening in a mix of recognition and raw panic that betrayed the depth of secrets she had guarded across decades, launching into a torrent of explanations about how Daniel's existence had been the catalyst for her flight from Ohio all those years ago, fearing the scandal would shatter the fragile facade of her marriage and drag us all into tabloid fodder about illegitimate lines and hidden paternities. Her voice cracking as she admitted the wedding farce with Victor had been a frantic bid to liquidate assets for a final escape, not just from debts, but from the looming confrontation with her past that Daniel's inquiries had unearthed through public records and DNA kits advertised on late-night infomercials. Seated around Jake's bed in an impromptu circle that felt both healing and invasive under the watchful eyes of the nursing staff who bustled in with fresh vitals charts, the revelations cascaded like a dam breaking, Daniel detailing how he had traced Evelyn's trail through old addresses and mutual acquaintances, discovering Jake's plight via a shared hospital database alert that connected their similar genetic vulnerabilities to rare infections, his anonymous contributions stemming from a sense of inherited duty rather than obligation, while Evelyn confessed her terminal diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, confirmed by scans she had hidden in Victor's condo safe, the illness accelerating her desperation for one last hurrah that explained the tone-deaf money grab as a misguided plea for legacy rather than malice. A twist that softened the edges of my fury into a complicated empathy because it humanized her flaws as products of fear and frailty rather than calculated cruelty, even as it forced me to confront how her silence had amplified Jake's isolation in ways that no amount of retroactive storytelling could fully mend. Jake, stirring weakly amid the emotional undercurrents swirling around his monitors, managed a faint smile that acknowledged Daniel's presence before lapsing back into medicated rest. His earlier cryptic whisper about Evelyn's promise now clarified as a coerced vow from a teenage Jake to keep family skeletons buried in exchange for her occasional checks that had supplemented our lean years. A pact that bound him in unintended loyalty and perhaps contributed to the stress exacerbating his collapse, leaving me to navigate the labyrinth of forgiveness with a heart heavy from the weight of choices that pitted blood reconciliation against self-preservation. The ultimate revenge unfolded not in vengeance, but in a clever redirection of resources that evening, as I gathered the trio in the hospital cafeteria over trays of cafeteria fare that tasted of institutional blandness, proposing. We auction Evelyn's gaudy engagement ring, Victor having forfeited it in custody, through an online charity platform dedicated to rare disease research. The proceeds earmarked directly for Jake's ongoing care and Daniel's emerging role as a familial anchor. A witty maneuver that transformed her symbol of folly into a tangible force for good, watching her nod through tears as bidders clamored for the story behind the sparkle, the funds tallying thousands by midnight in a satisfying irony that repaid her opportunism with communal uplift without a trace of personal spite. Yet as the days blurred into a tentative recovery for Jake, discharged to a rehab facility where Daniel visited with tales of their shared heritage that bridged gaps I had never imagined, doubts lingered like fog over Lake Erie. Evelyn's health claims verified by medical records she finally shared, but her motives forever tinged with ambiguity. Had the wedding demand been a genuine cry amid her decline, or a final manipulative ploy to test loyalties before the end? And what of the promise Jake referenced, hinting at deeper entanglements like contested estates or unspoken adoptions that Daniel's own searches had only scratched the surface of, leaving unresolved threads that nagged at quiet moments? Weeks later, back in my Elm Street home with Jake convalescing nearby and Evelyn settled into palliative care down south under Daniel's watchful coordination, an unmarked envelope arrived in the mail. Its contents a single yellowed letter in my father's handwriting detailing a long-buried trust fund tied to the very accounts Hargrove had frozen, suggesting Evelyn's deceptions masked protections rather than thefts. The implications rippling outward to question whether forgiveness was a luxury or a necessity in the tapestry of flawed kinships that define the American struggle for connection amid hardship, propelling me, and anyone who has weathered similar storms, to ponder the shadows we inherit and the truths we choose to illuminate, with some enigmas destined to fade unanswered into the horizon of what might have been.